The PS2 had a huge library of games, but one part that made the console special was the revival of several iconic games from the 80s. Rygar, Shinobi, and Altered Beast all come to mind. However, there was one game that took an entirely different path, ultimately culminating in what many deem the perfect spiritual successor to a beloved franchise. That series is Maximo, Capcom Digital Studios' answer to Ghosts and Goblins in 3D. What happened to this franchise though? Why does Capcom seem uninterested in reviving it after so many years? This is what this video will be about. Welcome to the untold history of Maximo. With the release of the N64, several beloved 2D games made the leap to 3D. Titles like Earthworm Jim 3D, Super Mario 64, Gex, and Rayman 2 all come to mind. With the technical advancements 3D brought to the table, it made sense that several developers would attempt to break into the third dimension. Huge publishers like Sega, Konami, and Square Enix all joined, including Capcom as well. Capcom back in the late 90s had plans to turn one of their iconic series into 3D. That game was to be Ghosts and Goblins 3D on the PS1, which never got past the concepting phase. Then Ghosts and Goblins 64 came after. Instead of following in the footsteps of its former predecessors, the game was in 3D and would have taken heavy inspiration from Super Mario 64. After Edge magazine and several media outlets were invited to take a look at the game back in November 1996, the game, however, was later quietly cancelled. No actual gameplay footage was shown to the public, and neither any ROM exists of the game online. Rumors have it that the reason for the game's cancellation was due to the N64 underperforming in Japan. Eventually, Capcom saw no reason to continue with the project. It wasn't until a year later that David Saylor and Mark Rogers pitched their own version of Ghosts and Goblins to Capcom in the form of Maximo. Back in 1995, Capcom of Japan began its business expansion outside the country. They established Capcom Digital Studios, a subsidiary of Capcom USA. The first project CDS worked on was Final Fight Revenge. CDS was mainly responsible for the programming at the time, while the design work was done by the Japanese division at Capcom. After the game was launched, the studio was allowed to pitch game ideas to Capcom of Japan. All of the ideas pitched were ultimately denied, including the original concept of Maximo, an adult-only video game that would have taken heavy inspiration from Army of Darkness, Capcom's Trojan, and Black Tiger. Originally titled Maximo the Dark Knight, the game's concept would have featured mature elements worthy of an adult-only game. This is explored in an interview on the N64 website with William Anderson. Here's a short read.
At the time, Capcom was seriously considering doing a hard R-rated for violence and sex dark Maximo medieval fantasy game, and they wanted me to write up a concept bible and opening game cinematic introduction.
He continued,
"This was a dream come true, as I was a big fan of Michael Moorcock's brilliant Eric book series and a real opportunity to delve into my own dark side and cut loose with some edgy, over-the-top world building and scenarios."
Unfortunately, despite how well this concept looked great on paper, Capcom of Japan ultimately denied the pitch. The reason for this is as follows.
Once we submitted the full game design document to Capcom Japan, along with the concept art we produced, they pushed back and said that they wanted all of the realistic looking games to come out of Capcom Japan. So that's when we had to change the look and feel of the game.
Once this initial concept that was supposedly coming to the N64 was denied, something else took its place. Following the cancellation of Maximo the Dark Knight, CDS swiftly pivoted their focus to crafting a more light-hearted and universally appealing Maximo around 1999. The new direction aimed to deliver a charming action-adventure experience that could be enjoyed by nearly everyone. Development on a new iteration of Maximo began life in 1999 on the N64, but due to the constant change in console competition back then, Maximo once shifted development to the Dreamcast as well. However, that was merely a short-lived moment before the engine's development briefly switched to PC while the developers were waiting for Capcom of Japan to send them the PS2 dev kit.
The engine was written from scratch for the PS2, but it actually was originally going to be a Nintendo game, then we switched to the Sega Dreamcast, and finally Sony PS2. So it's possible we could have finished the engine sooner if we had not been asked to change platforms a couple of times.
Maximo, The Dark Knight, according to N64, would have acted as a spiritual sequel to Toru Fujiwara's Ghosts and Goblins, but this new iteration of Maximo, titled Maximo Ghosts to Glory in North America and simply Maximo everywhere else, acted as a more of a homage to G&G. David Siller saw the rapid decline of arcade and old-school gameplay, so he and his team wanted to bring that feeling back by fusing all the elements from high-profile action-adventure games with the brutal difficulty of Ghosts and Goblins franchise. He wasn't alone in this endeavor. Mark Rogers was his right-hand man. Not only this, but to give Maximo a unique flair, the art style of the game was done by Susumu Matsushita, known for his continuous contributions to magazines like Famitsu, and the design of several famous mascots. Since David Siller and his team were huge fans of old-school games, this was reflected in Maximo, as the team at CDS placed special emphasis on the design and rendering of the characters and the game's world, as well as putting a great deal of work into the environmental effects. Siller and his team often drew the designs of levels, storyboards, and scripts on paper using pencil and pen, the old-fashioned way. Maximo aimed big with its decision to opt for 3D as opposed to Ghosts and Goblins 2D perspective, something Capcom of Japan was still trying to figure out how to perfect with titles like Mega Man Legend during the PS1 era. Interestingly, according to the lead artist Jonathan Casco, Maximo is going to be CDS' answer to previous Capcom 3D games in terms of technical prowess, offering 3D perspective, solid controls, faster loading times, and more. A message that would have spoken, we, an American branch, got the skills to do this.
Maximo was a game that was supposed to be a fun 3D action game with roots tapping those earlier arcade titles. It was also the kind of game we thought that Capcom Japan was making. Capcom Japan did not have many games featuring real-time 3D environments. The closest thing they had at the time, to our knowledge, was Mega Man Legends, which featured a true third-person perspective with a follow cam.
However, something interesting happened afterwards. According to an old article from IGN, the very first mention of a spiritual successor to Ghosts and Goblins was hinted at during Famitsu's February 17, 2000 magazine issue. The article revealed major information like the basic premise, the main story, and several pieces of information detailing Susumu Matsushita's involvement in the art department. Around 2 months later, Capcom showcased its upcoming games on the PS2. Yoshiki Okamoto briefly talked about several titles like Onimusha Warlords, where a trailer was shown with Samanosuke slaying Genemas left and right. Once that got out of the way, Okamoto mentioned the name Maximo. Apart from him saying it is like Ghosts and Goblins but in 3D, nothing major was revealed at that moment. It wasn't until the following year that Capcom finally showcased the game at E3 2001 in Los Angeles alongside Devil May Cry, Onimusha Warlords, Capcom vs SNK 2, Mega Man Battle Network, and more. Now here is where things start to become interesting. While I mentioned that Maximo was to be CDS' answer to many Capcom 3D games, the truth is that they weren't even aware of Devil May Cry's development at all. Like all of us, They've only learned about the game until it was shown to the public.
And then they surprise us with Devil May Cry, which they claim accidentally happened during a bug they found in Resident Evil development. The reason why I mention this is to show how detached our studio was from our parent company during the production of Maximo. We didn't share resources, and we were left to make our own decisions, which allowed for the success our team achieved in delivering Maximo.
Capcom of Japan and Capcom of USA were completely detached from one another, with communication proven like an obstacle between the two to get things done. Working under the Iron Fist, as Jonathan Casco likes to nickname Capcom, wasn't easy.
Life is filled with ups and downs. So, live it up. Live life to the maximo. Maximo, only from Capcom. Rated T for teen.
After around 2 years and a half into development, Maximo Ghosts to Glory was finally released on December 27, 2001, first in Japan, then later on February 12, 2002 in North America, and a month later in Europe. Capcom of Japan was particularly uncertain of Maximo at first, but they were eventually taken by surprise when the game was almost complete. Intrigued about what CDS has created, they decided to market and release the game in Japan. Both Capcom USA and Capcom Japan heavily advertised the game across the globe, with Maximo even setting foot into countries like South Korea, Germany, and Australia. Maximo's marketing was as huge as other first-party Capcom games like Devil May Cry and Onimusha. The game was everywhere, from funny TV commercials to print ads and also trailers that showcased everything the player needed to know about the game. Maximo stole the show. CDS succeeded with Maximo, whereas Capcom failed with their attempts to turn Ghosts and Goblins into 3D. The success of the game continued to grow till it was re-released on the budget labels Greatest Hits in North America and The Best in Japan. However, circling back, another reason why Capcom of Japan was surprised with Maximo as a major hit was because of Final Fight Revenge's low performance in the past. But after Maximo's success, things changed, or they seemed so. There is an untold history behind the making of the Maximo series which will be explored even further. For now, let's delve into the gameplay, the main story of Maximo, and some of the inspirations behind the making of the game. Despite being hailed by David Seder as a homage to Ghosts and Goblins, the developers were very careful not to absorb many elements from G&G. Instead, they borrowed from a cast of diverse sources. Scott Rogers, for example, drew heavy inspiration from Disneyland in his level designs, particularly using his philosophical approach to incorporating Disney's weenie structure into video games. This influence is clear in his book Level Up, The Guide to Great Video Game Design, and his presentation at the GTC conference in 2015, titled Everything I Learned About Level Design, I Learned from Disneyland. According to Jonathan Casco, the lead artist of Maximo, the development team found other inspiration in various games, including several Capcom classics like Black Tiger. The game design of Maximo adopted a fluid approach, appearing linear yet offering multiple options for progressing through the game. Players could explore various paths, all leading to the same outcome, a boss fight that unlocks new avenues. The game still retained key elements from the Ghosts and Goblins series, like the armor that could break after receiving damage, the severe difficulty that nudges players to get better, and giving Maximo a pair of boxers, just like King Arthur. Maximo was also given a trusty sword that he slashes enemies with, a shield used to defend against attacks, and various power-ups along with special abilities that enhance Maximo's playstyle. The game went as far as introducing a save system that lets you pay to save. Not only this, but enemies weren't pulling any BB punches on the player either. It was a game that demanded skill and patience. The game's story is about Maximo, a king who returns to his kingdom to discover it's in ruins, ruled by the dark magician known as Achille, who also held Maximo's queen, Sophia, as a captive. Maximo attempts to strike the magician, but the latter's overwhelming power results in Maximo's demise from a single fatal blow. Despite Maximo's death, he is granted a second chance when the Grim Reaper appears. Angry with how Achille is stealing souls from the underworld, both agree that Achille must be stopped at all costs. Maximo returns to life in full glory, marking the beginning of the game.
洋服を着ていてもいなくてもお前の強さは変わらない。お前はお前だ。パンツ一丁になっても戦う。それが勇気というものだ。マキシモ。戦え。Capcom.
Before Maximo came to life, numerous changes were implemented during its development phase. Various prototype builds are available on the Hidden Palace website for those interested in giving them a try. Some of the changes made prior to the game's release was Maximo's bar. In the prototype build, the abilities icon was changed from this to this. Another change was the absence of several sound effects. In the July 2001 build of the game, which was supposedly only 10% complete according to various sources, Maximo's death sound was notably absent. Maximo barely uttered any sounds in the build. Another intriguing change that didn't make it into the final game was the deteriorating shield effect. In one of the prototype builds, before Maximo lost his shield, players could witness it slowly falling apart before vanishing altogether. However, this effect was ultimately absent from the final release. The reason for omitting the deteriorating shield effect was to maintain a consistent 60 frames per second throughout the game, as mentioned by one of the developers at CDS to Maximo Capcom Archives on Twitter. One of my favorite changes from the prototype build wasn't Maximo's shiny silver armor. It was the very goldish armor of Maximo, reminiscent of a... Anyway, these were just a few changes I've noticed. There is more to uncover. For those interested in delving deeper into the prototype builds, I recommend checking out Maximo Capcom Archives on YouTube. After Maximo Ghosts to Glory's success, a sequel was greenlit and development began immediately. What happened after that? Did the game perform well? Did the success of Maximo Ghosts to Glory give birth to any comic adaptation? And how was the situation with Capcom of USA and Capcom of Japan? Did it get any better? This will be explored in part 2. The second part will also explore why Capcom killed Maximo and why it may not return.